Hello everyone and welcome back to my analysis of PT Silent Hills. My name is Loveless, and tonight we're going to be looking at the various puzzles found within PT and analyzing how they work on a mechanical level, and determining whether or not PT holds up as an actually playable horror game under scrutiny. This is going to be a difficult subject to tackle as PT takes a very unconventional approach to its gameplay design, despite how familiar it might appear at first glance. Sure, we've all probably played our fair share of first-person horror games, but when was the last time you played one that required you to speak into your microphone to solve a puzzle? When it comes to video games, the horror genre is particularly interesting because horror games usually come in the form of either a puzzle game or an action survival game, or in some cases, a combination of the two. This may sound a bit odd to anyone unfamiliar with horror games, so allow me to elaborate. When most people think puzzle game, their first thought is probably something along the lines of Tetris, Portal, or even mobile games like Candy Crush, not Resident Evil or Fatal Frame. But puzzles have been an integral aspect of the horror genre pretty much since its conception in the late 90s. You will, more often than not, find a couple of puzzles littered throughout the experience. What's more is that when you do come across a puzzle in a horror game, it'll more than likely be either physics or inventory based. Physics-based puzzles would include the likes of which you'd see in Dead Space or Amnesia: The Dark Descent, where the goal is to move certain objects in the environment a certain way whilst trying to fight off or avoid enemies. On the flip side, inventory-based puzzles are typically seen in games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. These puzzles typically revolve around trying to get from one location to another, carrying certain key items you'll need to use to interact with a mechanism that will allow you to proceed, all the while trying to figure out what non-essential items you feel comfortable discarding to make room in your inventory for said key items. PT is a completely different game, however. There's no inventory system, and there aren't enough animations or even inputs in the game to allow for physical environmental interaction beyond very basic key events. Typical design philosophy would have the player come across a puzzle, be able to understand the solution, then try to figure out how to reach that solution using the tools made available to them. PT does just about the exact opposite. Progress is made in PT when you encounter something new in a loop. If you can't proceed through the loop door, then you need to figure out how to get it open. If you're able to loop, but nothing new is happening, then you're not making any progress either. So okay, that much is made readily apparent. You gotta keep looping and having new things happen. It's an easy to grasp goal, but the trouble for the player arises when they can't do just that. However, it's unlikely that the player, especially on a first time playthrough, will realize what the heck they even did to solve whatever puzzle they were on in the first place. Then there's the final puzzle, which I will henceforth be referring to as the truth sequence, as I did in the last video. This quote-unquote puzzle is so incredibly mind-boggling that its classification as a puzzle will forever have an asterisk next to it. So for those of you who do actually own PT and want a step-by-step guide, look no further because I'm going to be going through each and every puzzle in PT and elaborating on how they're meant to be solved in as much depth as possible. Much like when I was discussing Atmosphere, I'll be going through the puzzles sequence by sequence. This of course means I'll be starting with the game's very first puzzle that I believe almost epitomizes this game as a whole, as it managed to go under the noses of almost everyone who ever played it, both figuratively and literally. After taking the first step through the loop door, the player will realize they're trapped. A feeling that will be furthered upon as they proceed to the turn into the foyer. Now, the exit door that leads to the loop door is closed, and it appears it cannot be opened. So what the hell are you meant to do? At this point, the player will be inclined to take a look around. More than likely, they'll try and open the other doors in the house. The front door is locked, the bathroom door is locked, and the prior loop door is locked. However, once the player comes back into the foyer, they'll of course see that the exit door is now opened. You may have noticed a certain cockroach moving along the floor rather lackadaisically. If you follow it as it goes, you'll eventually come across a broken photo frame on the ground. Of course, the player doesn't need the cockroach to see the photo as it's hidden rather in plain sight, but the roach does exist for anyone who picks up on it. Within the broken frame is a chalk writing R3, which any PlayStation player will recognize as the input for clicking the right analog stick. It's not necessary to press the right stick to observe the photograph, as being close enough to it alone will trigger the opening of the exit door, but it does serve as something of a tutorial for anyone who maybe didn't try pressing every button once they started the game up. It's such a basic, yet somehow completely organic concept for a tutorial puzzle, and yet it's so eloquently subtle that, like most things in PT, it would go completely under the players' noses. Mind you, that's not an insult to the players. I actually only just saw this frame for the first time on a recent playthrough I was doing purely for test footage. Another important note to make of this is that the photograph on the ground here is actually the photo of Lisa, as if to imply the answers lie in her. However, that is purely my own speculation. I call this puzzle the hidden tutorial. It accomplishes a decent amount despite doing so little that I can't help but be impressed by it despite how simple and bare bones it actually is. It's not so much the concept as it is the execution, much like many things in PT. Moving on, our next puzzle is presented in a similar fashion. As the player approaches the loop door, it'll suddenly close on them. Most people will of course try to open said door, but it's locked. It's then that the player hears the creaking of a door opening behind them. As the player turns to investigate, they begin to hear a baby moaning from within the bathroom. At this point, the only input the player will have learned, aside from pausing or opening the PS4 dashboard itself, is R3, which zooms the camera in. Given that there is a sound coming from within the bathroom and the door is creaked just enough for the player to see inside, the only thing to do is peek inside and get spooked. The exit door then opens and the player can proceed. I call this the peek, and it does a fair job of allowing the player to piece together what they're supposed to do for themselves. The player should, at this point, know the one input of R3, and there might as well be a bright neon sign pointing towards the bathroom saying, "Look inside." So it doesn't take a great deal of deduction to figure this one out. Overall, a pretty decent second puzzle. So far, so good. The next puzzle, which I have labeled the locked bathroom, is probably the first puzzle that really stumped some people. Upon entering the bathroom and picking up the flashlight, the door will be slammed shut behind the player. At this point, the player will of course feel prompted to look around and will inevitably take a look into the sink. But even when things have quieted down, the player will be unable to open the door. This will of course prompt the player to look around some more and even try interacting with the environment using the R3 input. Inevitably, the player will think to look into the mirror, and upon zooming in towards the bathroom door's reflection, it'll finally crack open, allowing the player to open it fully and proceed through the next loop. This puzzle is a bit scripted because you have to wait for specific key events to play out, such as Lisa trying to open the door and the haunting to end. Credit where it's due though, this is the first puzzle that requires the player to think outside the box, and it also just makes for a really good set piece, ramping up the tension and atmosphere and frightening the player. Pretty much everyone I've seen play PT was extremely anxious to get the hell onto the next loop once they finally escaped the bathroom. I also think that the pure visual of the player having to look into the mirror at the door frame to unlock it is something that will stick with the player throughout the experience as they try to solve more and more esoteric puzzles. The following is probably the most infamous outside of the truth sequence, and I'll be describing it as the look behind you puzzle for reasons that should be quite apparent at this point. In this loop, following the locked bathroom, the player will turn into the foyer and hear the radio playing the same broadcast from earlier, only this time with random interference from the same guy delivering a number of subliminal messages. The exit door is open, however, so the player will more than likely think that this is nothing and that they can proceed. However, anyone playing will quickly notice that nothing has changed except for the exit door now being closed. This is a pretty clear indicator to the player that they need to do something in order to proceed. Naturally, the player's attention will be drawn to the radio on the counter. The broadcaster will of course tell the player to look behind you in a very threatening tone, which should convey to the player to do just the opposite. And of course, if the player does turn around and get caught by Lisa, the punishment will serve as a clear indicator that they screwed up. So if the player is not supposed to turn around from the radio, then obviously that means they're on the right track of solving the puzzle. Of course, anyone who takes a moment to examine the counter will pick up on the photograph, and anyone with an eye for detail will notice that something's changed about it. Now there's a big blue cross and a note saying to gouge it out. Anyone remotely familiar with the DualShock controller will then think to press the corresponding button, thus solving the puzzle and allowing them to proceed. This is definitely the first puzzle that really stumped a number of players, and it is admittedly pretty obtuse. To use Soapy Warpig as an example again, it took her nearly 10 whole minutes to figure this puzzle out, and she didn't have any kind of guide to look up. She was certainly collaborating with friends, mainly throughout the course of the truth sequence, but from what I can tell, she didn't have anyone telling her the solution. She just happened to look at the picture and figure it out for herself.
Gouge it out. Oh! Okay. Well, it only took about 20 minutes.
Hell, Pewdiepie basically did it by accident.
What is that sound coming from? Oh god.
Scene after neighbors called 911 found the father in his car listening to the radio.
Oh my god.
Several days before the murder, look behind you. I said, look behind you.
No. No.
Strange spell. There was another family shot to death in the same last month, and in December last year,
thank god.
a man used a rifle and meat cleavers to murder his entire family.
Oh my god. Oh god, what happened? I didn't mean to poke her eye out. I swear to god it wasn't me. Oh my god, she's even prettier now.
Next up is the final puzzle of the game prior to the truth sequence, which you may remember me describing as the hell puzzle in a prior video. If the Gouge It Out puzzle was the first to stump players momentarily, then the Hell puzzle would be the first wall that people came across. At this point, the player will definitely have noticed the writing on the wall in the foyer saying, "I can hear them calling to me from." Wait a second.
I want to tell you I'm hell. What? There's no way. What's he talking about? If he really was L, he'd never admit to it. I thought this guy was a bit strange, but this is pretty extreme.
And upon realizing they're stuck in the Hell loop, they'll be prompted to investigate the environment as they have with previous puzzles. It'll more than likely take a few minutes of looking around, but inevitably the player will come across the writing on the corner next to the phone saying, "Hello." It's at this point that the player will more than likely realize what the goal of the puzzle is, but even if they don't, they will inevitably come back to it whilst investigating, as it is a rather noticeable change in the environment. When the player inevitably returns, they will notice that a letter is missing. At this point it should have clicked. Looking away and looking back to the hello message will cause letters to disappear. If it's not clear to the player at this point where those letters have been going, then again, they will inevitably see the letters having moved to the foyer wall just by briefly looking around. One way or another, even if the player is aimlessly looking around the environment with absolutely no clue what is going on, they will almost definitely notice the hello message and how its letters seem to disappear. I hope I'm not coming off as patronizing here. I'm only trying to explain this in as much depth as possible because, as stated, this was the first puzzle that really stopped people in their tracks. It's also an extremely tense moment, as described in the atmosphere video, so the player will definitely be more prone to error here than at any point prior. On that note, something else that's important to note here is that this is the first puzzle with an actual fail state that forces the player to restart in a new loop. That is, of course, barring the potential fail state of Lisa capturing you. This is a more mechanical failure that forces you to retry in a successive loop rather than being outright attacked by Lisa. If the player looks away from the hello writing and then looks back, a letter will be moved to the foyer. Once the letters HELL have been moved, the player looks away from the remaining characters and back once more, the O and exclamation point will both disappear, and the foyer writing will remain incomplete, forcing the player to re-loop. This was a smart move by the designers, because it's more than likely that the player will look back to ensure each letter that they need has been moved. Once the player has a grasp of how this puzzle works, they should be able to figure out pretty easily what the word is that needs to appear in the foyer. So for the player to look back once more after getting the 4 characters they already needed just makes sense to punish them for. So once the player has caused the appropriate letters to disappear, all that's left is to check the writing in the foyer, at which point the player will be met with the laughter of Lisa as well as the unlocking sound of a door. So those are all the puzzles in the game prior to the truth sequence that are required to progress. However, there is one more puzzle that's actually completely optional. Throughout various loops, while investigating, the player will more than likely zoom in on one of several key locations that contains a torn piece of a photograph. There are 6 in total, 2 on the right side of the hallway, one being on the plant and one being beneath the digital clock, one on the floor in the corner to the right of the phone counter, one between the bathroom and the foyer in the corner on the ceiling, one in the steps leading to the loop door, and finally, one in the pause menu. Yes, in order to completely solve this puzzle, you have to go into the pause menu, click the R3 input, and watch as the camera zooms in on a brain scan. The pieces of this picture come together to form a complete photograph of Lisa prior to the events of PT. Upon finding each piece of the puzzle, you'll see various texts of various languages appear briefly on the screen that, when put together, form a complete piece of writing. I already went over this in more depth in the story video, but to reiterate briefly, the complete message in English reads as,
"I whispered your name, but the wind of the night took your voice away. I didn't move anymore during the waiting. Then his finger slipped on my hand. It was a cold hand. Body was trembling. Never moving a step, his hand in mine. I waited for it to pass. And through the mist of fading consciousness, I believed I heard a phone."
So that's it. That's every puzzle in the main game of PT. Now comes the fun part, the truth sequence. This puzzle is unlike any other because there's literally nothing to suggest what the solution is, and it has nothing to do with the story of PT. Everything else prior to the collapse of the 4th wall was in some way telling a story that could be pieced together, but from this point on the focus is the reveal of Silent Hills. This is easily one of the most infamous puzzle sequences I've ever seen in a video game, and without a guide it really does seem something like a roll of the dice. Soapy Warpig was the first person on record to ever solve it, and she spent over an hour just fumbling around with zero idea of what to do and no guide whatsoever. She was collaborating with friends, of course, but they were as completely clueless as she was, as anyone was. I've watched her stream of the game twice at this point, and even though I know what generally needs to be done, I still have no idea how in the hell she managed to figure it out. For the longest time, there was no refined solution to the truth sequence, and depending on where you looked, you would find a variety of discrepancies between different guides. One guide might tell you that you have to interact with the radio, while another would tell you to stand before the writing in the foyer. Some speculated that the various colors emitted by your flashlight were indicative of different solutions, and don't even get me started on what it was that had to be said into the mic to get that second baby laugh. Speculation on this included Jay, Jareth, Jack, Lisa, Hello, Help Me, Kojima, Silent Hills, 204863, and the list goes on and on and on. So here is my solution to the final puzzle of PT. I have played PT countless times over the years, especially when it first launched, and this is the solution that I have had 100% success rate with, so it appears to be an alright method. I'm not ignorant to the fact that those of you who've looked into this rabbit hole of insanity have probably heard this statement a number of times. However, this is the method that works between me and my friends in all of our different PlayStations, every single time that we've attempted it. Upon entering the corridor of the truth sequence, I approach the halfway point of the hall approximate to the digital clock. This isn't required, but I generally do it so that after taking the proper number of steps I end up as close to the phone as possible. Here I stand perfectly still facing forward until the clock strikes midnight. Once it is midnight, a haunting will begin. I stand perfectly still until the haunting eventually subsides, and proceed to take 10 steps forward, pressing the analog stick softly so as not to step too far. It's also extremely important that you have a headset on, or you have no other sound in the room, because you are going to need to make sure that you take exactly 10 steps, not a single one more, not a single one less. Turning will also make this an extremely difficult process and require you to repeat in another loop. After 10 steps, I stop next to the phone and the first baby laugh is triggered. At this point, I speak into my mic. Although it's my assumption that you are technically supposed to speak into the mic whilst near the phone, I never actually face the phone because I find it more difficult to make accurate steps while turning. It's possible, but it's really, really difficult. Furthermore, I have done this whilst facing away from the phone, and it has worked when doing so. Anything I say into the mic seems to work the majority of the time, and I've never really failed at this step so long as I am talking enough. I've also read from countless people that they just start saying whatever the hell they can think of, or they'll be having a conversation with another person in the room and it works for them almost every time. I honestly don't believe you're supposed to say anything specific because I've done this step so many times and said so many different things over the years, and nothing has ever worked with a 100% success rate. So basically I just ramble like a madman. After speaking into the mic, the second baby laugh is triggered, and it's at that point that I stand completely still and do absolutely nothing. Some have speculated that you need to brush your finger across the DualShock 4's touchpad, however this is not the case. You just have to stand completely still while the controller vibrates and the haunting ensues. After a few seconds, the controller will stop and the final baby laugh will be triggered. At this point the phone will ring, and I turn towards it and interact using the R3 command. Even if there's a haunting going on, it will immediately shut down and you'll be free to move out of the loop. And that's it. That's the solution to the truth sequence. At least, my solution. I'm going to take this time to address some criticism that has been directed towards this puzzle over the years, as I feel there is a great deal of misunderstanding surrounding it. Please note that I'm not saying you're wrong for disliking the puzzle. Frankly, it's clear as day just why anyone wouldn't. Just that I think a clearer understanding of its purpose and the design philosophy behind it would perhaps help people come to a more objective understanding of it. First and foremost, I believe that the truth sequence is there to act as something of a post-game level, in that it takes place outside the story of PT and has no connection to what seems to happen within the rest of the game. Narratively speaking, it isn't acting as a blocking point that prevents the player from progressing, nor is it comparable to a progress halt in a full-priced game, as PT was just a free demo. This is in no way similar to, say, the Bed of Chaos in Dark Souls, where the game just completely falls apart and potentially ruins a person's experience. Sorry, I just had to get in a shot. Now, if Silent Hills were to have been completed and released as a full-priced game, and this type of sequence were to exist in the main story path, that would be a major problem. However, if it existed as a mysterious side puzzle or even as a post-credits gameplay sequence, then I think it would actually fit in well, because then it wouldn't feel like something that was just stopping the player from proceeding. That's not a deflection of criticism, mind you. I just want to make it clear that I think there's a very important distinction to make between utterly absurd puzzles that halt progress in the main story of a game that you spend a lot of money on, versus what is debatably optional content in a completely free experience. To further elaborate, I don't consider it a bad thing that in order to access some of the secret endings in Silent Hill 2, you will more than likely have to look up how to do so, as the methods to do so are pretty well hidden and obscure. Even the two most commonly seen endings of Silent Hill 2 require rather subtle steps to achieve, but they fit perfectly within the narrative that Silent Hill 2 is aiming for, which is something that, were we to be fair, should be considered for PT as well. PT was ultimately intended to serve as the reveal for Silent Hills, and Kojima wanted the final sequence to be as difficult to solve as possible so that those who cracked the case would have earned it. One could easily argue, of course, that since the puzzle only took a few hours to solve, that it failed in that regard. However, I don't believe that to be the case when I examine the steps that are actually required to solve the damn thing. Or at least, seemingly required. Whether or not PT was solved in 1 hour, half an hour, 1 week, or a month doesn't really make a difference. Frankly, there were loads of people playing it, so it was only a matter of time before even a single person figured it out, regardless of how utterly absurd the solution was. Kojima himself said he was surprised at how quickly players managed to figure it out, thinking it would take at least a week to do so. I don't consider it a failure on PT's part that its intentionally obtuse final sequence was solved so quickly. I consider it a rousing success on behalf of Soapy Warpig that she managed not only to do so, but to be the first to ever do it. Kojima said rather clearly that he wanted PT to rally players from around the world to solve a mystery, and it's inarguable that it managed to do just that. It accomplished exactly what it was aiming for. Alright, so with all of that said, is the truth sequence a good puzzle? Well, by conventional standards, no. The answer is a plain no. The player is completely oblivious to what the goal of the puzzle even is, and the solution itself is still being debated over half a decade later. Were I to encounter this in a full-priced game, and were it to prevent me from making story progress, then I would completely pan it for being an incompetent and poorly thought-out way of just halting the player's progress, and all but requiring third-party assistance to figure out within reason. That being said, when considering that this took place within a free demo that was intended to make people work together to solve a puzzle, it must be said that it was a rousing success, and it has become something of a legend in the horror gaming community as far as cryptic puzzles go. It works as intended within the product it exists in. If the reveal of the new Silent Hill title being directed by the likes of Kojima and Del Toro, with the support of the original Team Silent and Junji fucking Ito starring Norman Reedus, had been hidden behind a very conventional puzzle that was easy to solve, then the actual solving of it would have been far less satisfying as a result. The conversation would have ended very quickly, and PT would have been considerably less memorable because of it. Now, that's not to say that PT itself, prior to the final puzzle, was ultimately forgettable. Clearly the opposite was the case, but I don't think anyone would argue that the truth sequence is something that has stuck with people for years now. In my personal experience, when I bring PT up in a conversation, most people immediately go to the final puzzle as a point of reference. Not because it's bad, but because it stood out in their mind as something that defined the experience, regardless of their personal feelings towards it as a puzzle. I think the truth sequence is a fascinating piece of an otherwise incredible game, and there's definitely a conversation to be had about it regarding design philosophy and how puzzles work in video games. This has, of course, just been my 2 cents on the subject, but I'm very curious to hear what others may have to say regarding it as well. I also want to make it clear that I don't consider myself a puzzle game aficionado by any stretch. The only puzzle games I've ever put a great deal of time into were Portals 1 and 2, and Catherine. Aside from that, there is of course horror games that consist primarily of puzzles like the old school Resident Evil and Silent Hill games, or Amnesia: The Dark Descent. But I'm not going to postulate that just because I got the Platinum Trophy for RE2 and 3, or that I'm working on the Platinum Trophy for Catherine Full Body, that I'm some kind of puzzle-solving genius. Furthermore, when I first played PT, these puzzles went completely over my head. It took me hours to beat this game. I know I just spent the last while explaining the solutions to each puzzle, and how the game subtly suggests in many areas what the player is intended to do, but that is not to insinuate that not being able to recognize the design, let alone on a first playthrough, is in some way a failure on the player's part. PT was designed with the intent of being extremely esoteric and difficult to get a firm understanding of. This way, players who couldn't figure out the puzzles would discuss their findings with one another on the internet. This sort of design is highly reminiscent of the pre-internet days of gaming, where games like Metal Gear Solid or The Legend of Zelda had puzzles, levels, and even boss fights that would cause players to have to stop and talk about it with their friends, rather than having a readily available guide just a Google search away. Of course, this no longer applies, as the game has existed long enough for solutions to exist all over the internet, but the original experience will always be remembered by those who participated. So anyways, that about does it for the puzzles of PT. I've really started to get into the groove when it comes to writing all of this and editing these videos, so I'm feeling pretty good about the progress I'm making, and I sincerely hope my work reflects what I put into it. I know that the audio in the first video was not good, to say the least, but hey, I think I've come a pretty good way. This is also my first time really explaining the mechanics of video game puzzles in a professional format, so I'm eager to see the reception, especially since I'm, like I said, not a puzzle game aficionado by any sense. Thank you all once again for the support. The next video will probably be quite shorter and more fun and speculative than mechanical and objective, so I hope you're all looking forward to it and the discussion about the radio.